So our third and not but last emerging scientist is Zita Ritchie, based at Wollongbar, the far north coast. Her role is Dairy Development Officer with the New South Wales DPI. She has been involved in the dairy business for Future Climate Project on the mid-north coast near Kempsey, and we will be presenting on the key findings. So welcome.
On now? Yeah. Okay, thanks Josh. So as I mentioned last night, so I'm just going to talk today about the Dairy Business for Future Climates project. And I think this is quite topical too, given yesterday's kind of presentations on intensification and given the the more recent kind of events we've had around flooding, drought and bushfire. It's been really interesting working with this group on the mid-north coast. So we selected a case study farm, a focus kind of farm near Kempsey, Rollins Plains, so Mick and Paula Gray for those that haven't met them during the conference. And we worked with Mick and Paula over a 12-month period, and it was supported by a reference group. So we had about 10 or 12 farmers on that group with a couple of technical advisors, so Dan Armstrong from Victoria and Brendan Cullen. So Brendan did the climate modelling and Dan Armstrong did the economic kind of analysis. So with that group, we took the base farm, which was a pasture-based system, milking 230 cows. Mick and Paula are milking most year-round, avoiding the summer months, and took that case study farm and looked at, okay, well, what are the likely impacts we're likely to see for that farm out to 2040? And then look at, okay, well, given those impacts, what are the physical impacts on milk production and on the farm? And what does that look like for economically on the farm out to 2040? And then what are some of the options we could do to adapt or to mitigate those impacts of the future climate? So what did we find? So for that particular region out to 2040, it was likely that an area around Port Macquarie, Kempsey area would have a climate similar to that of Lismore or southeastern Queensland. So out to 2040, we were likely to see an increase in temperature by about 1 degree. And look, we've already experienced some of that warming from that baseline period from 1990 to 2009 that we're using. And so that, has a huge impact on heat stress, which we're all mostly aware of. Interestingly though, rainfall, we weren't likely to see much of a change in annual rainfall. And that showed through some of the modelling that the feed-based system is actually quite robust in this part of the world, which was quite pleasing, I thought, considering, contrasting with what we're seeing in Victoria with some of the changes in climate, that kind of contraction of the growing season. And that kind of spring kind of cutting out a little bit earlier. So in terms of rainfall, on average, not likely to change much, although are likely to see a bit of a decrease in winter rainfall for this particular region. And then overall, out to 2040 for this particular farm, likely to see a decline in milk production by about 3 to 4%. So, and that's probably reflective of what we're likely to see in this area around mid-north coast. So for this farm, based on these impacts, out to 2040, likely to see a drop in profit by $20,000 a year for this base farm. So given this information, then we kind of brought the group together and thought, all right, what are some of the options that this farm would like to consider given this information, and the group at large, or what kind of they were considering on their farms? So then this is where we kind of broke it down into 3 different pathways, I guess. So what we talked about yesterday, a lot of farmers are considering intensifying. So we thought, okay, well, for this farm, if we move to a freestall barn situation, if we were going to invest in that much infrastructure, we'd probably want to see an increase in cow numbers, high producing cow, relying a lot more on board-in feed. So we moved to like my drawing here, the freestall barn, not as good as Francisco's. Number 2, adapt. So making more of a moderate capital investment, so putting in a feed pad and like a shed. So Mick and Paula were already kind of considering this as an option, so it was pretty relevant to include. So that was number 2. And 3, looking at the other end of the spectrum, what would happen if we kind of dialed the system right back? So maybe drop cow numbers on the farm, I think to about 200 we dropped it to, focusing more on homegrown feed, pasture-based, like utilising a lot more of homegrown feed, less reliant on board-in feed, and then that might change some of the labour as well. Drop some at 1 minute, thank you. So which one was best? I hate to say it, but no one option was better than the other, and there are pros and cons of each option. But intensify was a much greater capital investment, as we would be aware, and much greater exposure to risk in the external, especially with the external feed market. ADAPT really did show that it reduced the impact of heat stress out to 2040 using moderate capital investment. So that was a good option to look at there too. And then 3, simplify. All other risks were reduced, and that less reliance on bought-in feed, the external feed markets. However, the total operating profit of that option was, you've got a smaller piece of the pie left at the day. So if you're wanting to grow the business and service more debt, or take on more debt later on, it's less ability to do that. So what are my key messages? I guess the key takeaways are that looking at the future climate for this region, heat stress really is the key factor, and looking at strategies to manage that. No option was superior than the other, and they all have positive and negative aspects. But the ADAPT option for this farm really did show kind of a reasonable strategy to mitigate some of that impact of heat stress with moderate capital investment. And really, each option just depends on the circumstances and resources available to the farmer. So, yeah, it was a really great discussion and a great group to be involved in. But that's it for me. I think that's it. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Zita. Questions for Zita?
Yeah,
Yep, Paul.
Zita, I've heard that before on the podcast and stuff, and I learn something every time, so thank you. Just as you were talking through the simplify option and the reduce, because you've got less cows as a reduced income, was the consideration to potentially buy more land so you maintain? I know that's not always easy.
No, we didn't. We kind of stuck with the resources available. That came up in conversation about if we were to move to the freestall barn option, would we actually have to buy? The conversation came up around buying more land to maybe grow more crops rather than relying to buy all that purchase feeding. But for the simplified, no, it was kind of using the current land available. Yeah. And actually, it was interesting talking to Paula about this because she said we call it simplified, but it actually doesn't mean simple. So it's like if you've got to be a good pasture manager and want to focus on that area. And I guess for Mick and Paula, they enjoy being pasture managers, but for where they are in their farming career, they didn't really want that for their system at this point in time. But it's true, there's a lot of good management that comes into that option. Yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
Jane?
With option 3, simplified.
Yeah.
How does that treat the heat stress?
Yeah.
For thinking about animal welfare.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I can't remember in terms of, because they wouldn't have had extra shades. That would have been accounted for when we did the modelling and the impact on milk production. I don't know if we put in more trees into that. I can't actually answer that off the top of my head. Sorry, Jane. But in terms of when we looked at the rate of internal rate of return and operating profit, the simplify option was actually stacked up fairly well. So I'm not sure how that works though. If there was an extra shade to kind of mitigate that. I'll have to get back to you on that. Yeah, less cows. Yeah. I'll have to get back to you on that, Jane. That was a good question. Yeah.
Zita, I've got a question. Did you look at feeding? So I know in our area up here and some of the dairy-based work that gets done and some of the issues we have is with the high fibre C4 plants and through heat and all that sort of stuff, trying to get that through the animal and out. Did you look at anything like chicory, lucerne, improve production, better feeding, any of that sort of stuff?
It definitely came up in discussion, but in terms of the modelling we did, we just took the base farm as it is kind of now. Didn't really introduce any new crops or varieties into that modelling. But yeah, I mean, for them, they're using a lot of different species on farm, predominantly Kikuyu based. But but that's for sure for consideration. Yeah, in that options.
Greg?
Zita, I'm interested, the modelling, does it incorporate THI into that climate change? Because clearly that's a key impact on productivity.
Yeah, 100%. So with the biophysical modelling that Brendan Cullen did at Melbourne Uni, was incorporating all that THI research and the projections out to 2040.
Just before everyone wants to know what THI is?
Oh, temperature humidity index. So there's a certain threshold that dairy cows can tolerate, and out to with temperatures going up by a degree, it kind of changes that threshold. Yeah. Thanks, Greg.
Righto. Thanks very much. Thanks, Zita.